If you're in the market for a big, comfortable three-row SUV, the Acura MDX is too small for you, the Lexus TX is too expensive for you, and the Toyota Grand Highlander is not quite nice enough for you, you might want to check out something like this. This is the brand new Buick Enclave. It's the biggest, fanciest, and most powerful Enclave Buick has ever created. And there are definitely some solid reasons to choose this over the competition, most notably how much room you get on the inside thanks to its massive stretch for 2025, and the fact that honestly, I think the interior design is better even than that Lexus TX. Let's take a look. For this generation of GM's full-size unibody SUVs, they went back to the drawing board and they decided to give the various entries more distinct personalities, rather than simply trading the logo from a Chevy logo to a Buick logo, etc. This is the close relative to the Traverse and the Acadia, but as you can see, it definitely has a different vibe on the outside. But more importantly for most shoppers, I think actually, is the interior design, which is significantly improved over the outgoing model, and definitely prettier in my mind than the Chevy or the GMC. But let's talk about the front-end design first, because honestly, this is my least favorite angle on the Enclave. And I think it's because the design language that I think works well on their smaller cars has just been stretched a bit too much for the Enclave. This comes across as a little bit buck-toothed, a little bit beavery for me. Let me know what you think about that, of course, down there in the comment section. This is the top-end Avenir trim, and I think this grille works the best for me. If you get the ST trim with all the blacked out components, it actually makes that opening look even larger, at least to my eye. The LED headlights, those are over here, and they are full LEDs, as are the turn signals. Those are up here. Daytime running lights housed in that area as well. Some subtle chrome accents all the way around. It's actually hard to tell on camera, but this is not bright, shiny chrome. This is kind of a darkened chrome with bright chrome accents in the middle of it, and then more of a bright chrome surround and then chrome at the bottom. Going in for a closer look, you can see that these individual chrome elements are not symmetrical. They're sort of arrow-shaped, pointing towards the outside of the vehicle, and then as we come to the middle of the grille, we actually get arrows that point both ways there. And I have to apologize, this is not a satin chrome or a darkened chrome center grille. It's actually black, but because of the chrome elements and the lighting, it actually does kind of look like more of a tinted chrome look. At just over 207 inches long, this is not only the biggest Enclave they've ever built, but by a hair, it's a little bit longer than the Traverse and the Acadia. Most of that happens up front because the design, borrowed from, again, the rest of the Buick lineup, meant that they needed to stretch things out a little bit to have that distinctive Buick grille up front. It doesn't really change the interior dimensions, and the wheelbase is the same as the rest of the lineup. This is a big vehicle, and to give you an idea of how big it is, these wheels don't look enormous, but they're in fact 22-inch wheels. These are 275/45 R22 tires on the model. Since this is the Avenir trim, we also have the body color matched wheel arches instead of the blacked out wheel arches that you find in some of the other trims. Coming around to the back, we find full LED taillights. The turn signals, unfortunately, those are red, but they do feature animation, as you can see right there. Also featuring animation is the light bar in the Avenir trim. You get a light bar in the rest of the lineup, but it doesn't feature the startup animation where it starts glowing from the center and moves out to the side like we find in a lot of vehicles out there. There's a tasteful amount of chrome, I think, at the bottom of the bumper and in this mid-hatch section right here. They didn't go overboard with the chrome. And then we have these big twin exhaust tips in every trim. In an era where we find so many manufacturers actually kind of hiding the exhaust tips, I like the way that they've been highlighted in the lower bumper. This cutout here hides the hitch receiver. 5,000 pounds of towing capability is available. Going in for another closer look, we can see Easter eggs here in the taillight modules, a little Buick logo there, and they've really done a lot of work to give this taillight a bit of a presence when you approach the vehicle. So clear sections with the light pipes inside and the way that they've routed those LEDs around there, it's just kind of a really cool touch. Under the hood, we find the same 2.5-liter four-cylinder turbo as, you guessed it, the GMC and the Chevy, producing 328 horsepower, 326 pound-feet of torque. And it's going to route power to the front wheels by default. All-wheel drive is optional, including in the top-end Avenir trim. So if you don't need all-wheel drive traction and you want to get slightly better fuel economy, you can opt for the top-end trim with Super Cruise and everything else, but without all-wheel drive. Now, unfortunately, one thing you don't find under this hood, which you do find in not only luxury alternatives, but also mainstream alternatives, is any kind of hybrid or plug-in hybrid system. We don't know what the future holds, but GM has said that they're going to be investing more in traditional hybrids and plug-in hybrid technology, but we don't know when or if that might come to the Enclave. The roominess of this interior is a solid advantage for the Enclave, especially versus some of the smaller mid-size options like a Highlander or a Pilot, or even something like that Kia Telluride. Front seat comfort, however, falls a little bit behind some of the competition. The Lexus TX's front seats, I do think they're a little bit more comfortable than this, although they're not any more adjustable, and I think the Grand Cherokee L's front seats are the most comfortable in this segment, but the back seat is an awful lot tighter. We have a powered tilt telescopic steering column with a surprisingly long range of motion. Takes a while for it to scoot in and out, however. It's memory linked, of course, to the buttons over there on the door. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support in this Avenir trim, also front seat massage as well, and the front passenger seat has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. As far as headroom goes, we have gobs of it here in this model with the big panoramic moonroof, and the front seat tracks also move pretty far rearward. So if you're a taller driver or you have taller passengers in the front of the vehicle, this is certainly going to give you an awful lot more room than average. The size of the Enclave's interior is really obvious as you start moving rearward. The front seat's comfortably adjusted for me at 6 feet tall. There is just a ton of room in here. I measured it out before I broke my tape measure, and I had 9 inches of room between that front seat back and my legs. That means you could very comfortably put rear-facing child seats back here, absolutely no problem. And speaking of child seats, this is one of the few entries in this segment, if I press that button, that actually lets you leave a forward-facing child seat latch anchored into place, and you can still tilt and slide the seat forward. Of course, you are going to have to latch anchor that seat in place because the shoulder belt comes out of the pillar, not out of the seat itself. As I said, the Enclave is a great option for taller folks. This front seat's now all the way back in its tracks, and as you can see, I still have several inches of knee room left. I don't know if I could fit a rear-facing child seat there, but it'd be a solid contender. Headroom in the back, it obviously is lower than the front. I have maybe about 2 inches of headroom here versus about 4 inches of headroom up front, but let's check out the third row now. There's several ways to get into the way back. Obviously, you could crawl through the middle, you could fold the second row seats flat, or you can use that tilt slide mechanism to get access to the rear, and we have a really wide opening back here, making third row access among the best. Especially with 3-row SUVs, it's really important to talk about combined legroom, because gone are the days where a second row seat was completely fixed in place and didn't move front to back. The reality is there is more combined legroom in here, more room between the front and the back of the vehicle than in a Lexus TX, especially versus an MDX or an XC90 or anything along those lines. When you take a look just at rear seat legroom in a vacuum, like so many people do, you miss the forest for the trees. This second row seat can move forward and backward. So sure, if this seat is all the way back, you'll have less room back here than in a Lexus TX, if the second row person's mean. But in a realistic world, you actually have significantly more room in here for passengers than you find in the TX or an MDX or an XC90 or especially a regular sized Highlander. And any way you slice it, more headroom than average as well. Just check that out. This is more like full-size body-on-frame SUV kind of headroom. This third row is about as accommodating as a Tahoe or a Yukon, with certain exceptions. The seat bottom cushion is a little bit closer to the ground. It's also a hair narrower, although again, it's more than 4 feet wide in the back. Buick does give us a middle seat in the back with a shoulder belt that comes out of the ceiling, but as you can see, they've also given us a pretty flat profile back there for that opening, so the shoulder belt module does not cause any reduction in passenger capacity or cargo capacity right there around that, but it's of course going to be dangling out of the ceiling. Before we look back up front, let's take a look around the back. You can see we have hard plastics on the side here, hard plastics around the cup holders for the third row passengers. Logically, the third row seats are going to be folded most of the time, but if they are going to be frequently occupied, you should know that there's no soft touch armrest there. There are USB-C charge ports there. You can see that little tiny dot. And we have air vents in what I think is the best position for the third row, right up here on the ceiling. And just in case you're wondering, no latch anchors back here in the third row at all. Before we go into the cargo area itself, let's talk about the opening here. The hatch opens nice and high, but if you're over maybe about 6'2", you will be bumping your head right there on the catch. One thing I like though is that we have a pretty low load-in height and a really short rear bumper. That means that getting to your cargo is going to be pretty easy. Moving behind the hatch, not only do we find one of the largest cargo areas in this segment, solidly over 20 cubic feet behind the third row, we also find one of the widest cargo areas in this segment. Fortunately, I have my tape measure with me, and I measured 49.5 inches from opening side to opening side and 49 inches between the wheel wells. So if you want to grab a sheet of plywood from Home Depot, you can can actually put it inside here. Of course, it is going to stick out the back by about 10 inches because it's a little over 7 feet from the cargo opening hatch all the way to those seat backs up front, but this is still a really big cargo area. And that's not because Buick skimped on a spare tire. You'll actually find that underneath this cargo well. So if I pull that bag out and unscrew a bunch of plastic clips, the entire floor module lifts up, giving us access to the spare tire and, of course, the subwoofer. If you don't want to be seen in a minivan, but you want nearly minivan-like room, this, the Chevy or the GMC should definitely be on your list, because in practical terms, this is a bit more accommodating than the Grand Highlander. Now let's take a look around up front. Up here we have the controls for this big panoramic moonroof, and as you can see, it extends to just about Travis's head back there in the rear. He's got plenty of room, and kind of a fun twist, I just heard that apparently next year, if you wait till 2026, there will be an 8-seat version. The base model will offer a bench seat in the middle, we are told. Back up to the front though, we get height adjustable shoulder belts for the driver and front passenger, 2-way adjustable headrests. I would like to see 4-way in the top end Avenir trim. I do like the design of the seats, however. You can see the leather upholstery has kind of an interesting organic wavy pattern there in the stitching and in the perforations. Buick's done a really interesting job in this interior with perforations, helping dress things up with just those little dots on the upholstery. As you can see, we don't have terribly aggressive bolstering on the side cushion or the seat bottom cushion, so larger drivers shouldn't have any problem in here. It's not going to alienate any of those traditional Buick customers. The front doors, again, same sort of construction that we find on the rear doors, and this is where you're going to see that perforation motif that I mentioned. It kind of fades as it goes down and becomes more of a random pattern down there on the armrest section. I think that's a really elegant look. I really like what Buick has done with that. I also like the interior color options. There is a sort of navy blue and ivory interior. That's my favorite. This is my second favorite, with the sort of chocolate brown upper sections and ivory midsections and those sort of bronzed accents in the middle. We find hard plastics at the bottom of the door, for instance around that storage bin down there, but everything else is a soft touch injection molded plastic for the most part. Moving over to the dashboard here, you'll notice more of that same perforation motif in this section. There's of course ambient lighting in the interior, and even though there are a large combination of materials in here, I think they did a really good job integrating everything together. You can see that this panel, the soft touch panel, actually circles around the air vent and then continues as this stripe, separating this imitation metallic trim with the chrome edge right there from the the chocolate upper section of the dashboard, and then we have the plastic speaker grills over there. No metal grills in this interior, including up here on the pillar, but remember the price tag of this is an awful lot less than something like a Volvo XC90, where you would find those real accents. We also don't have an actual stitched upper section of the dashboard. This is an after-stitched soft touch injection molded panel, and you'll really notice that as you get to some of the extents, for instance around here, where you can see that's not an actual seam. It's just injection molded in there and then after-stitched to help dress things up. Because the dashboard I think looks so good, the only thing that sticks out to me is the center channel speaker grille, which I do think could have been integrated a little bit better. Also, I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of the shape of this big LCD, but it's certainly different than the competition, and it is in fact one single huge LCD. Not a split LCD like we find in some Hyundai products. This is more like the Genesis single LCD across the dashboard. Over here on this side, it supports CarPlay integration. You can see that this kind of looks like the screen that we find in the Cadillac, just upside down. So instead of curving around in this area, it has this sort of horn-rimmed glasses look right there. As a result of the eccentric shape of that, CarPlay cannot occupy the entire area. Also, Android Auto wouldn't occupy that entire area either, but the background, that's actually being driven by CarPlay, which is kind of cool. Of course, if I go to the car's native interface, then it's going to use more or less the entire screen, including the native mapping from Google. So that's one reason you might want to use that Google mapping. One of the other reasons you might want to use the Google mapping is, of course, because we have the other screen over there, which interestingly can either show Google mapping or it can actually do two-screen CarPlay. So right now I'm not in an area with any cell signal, so the CarPlay mapping is just a grid there. But if I was in an area with cell signal, you could actually have your CarPlay mapping here and your Google mapping there, or vice versa. You can actually do whatever you feel. Now over here on the driver's side of this display, it is highly configurable. We have a bunch of different displays, including things like our trip computer, that full map display I showed you earlier, or more of a safety system or autonomous driving assistant readout kind of display there. Moving out from there, we do find the driver monitoring module right there. That's part of the Super Cruise system, as is this LED bar right here on top of the steering wheel. Now, speaking of that steering wheel, that's also different than the Chevy or the GMC. It definitely looks like the rest of the Buick lineup. It is a little peculiar in one respect, though. We have shift paddles on the back of the steering wheel, but they don't do anything until you press the L button. That seems a little bit silly to me. Even putting the vehicle in the sport mode doesn't engage the shift paddles. You have to press the L button first, then you use the shift paddle. Seems just a tiny bit backwards. As we see in other GM steering wheels, the track up-down controls, they're on the left side of the back of the steering wheel. Volume up-down, they're over there on the right side. And that leaves the front end to have a lot more buttons than we'd normally find. So this button allows you to choose, for instance, your radio input, and then you select it with the OK button. We then have dedicated phone buttons, heated steering wheel button, the button to change the display of that cluster over there. And then on this side, we have the buttons for the Super Controls. And then on this side, we have the buttons for the Super Cruise system and the adaptive cruise control functionality there as well. Like a lot of other new GM products, the shifter has moved to a stock on the steering column. That's definitely a handy touch because it frees up this big center console area here. And this has a floating console design that we don't find in the Chevy or the GMC. So we have a huge storage area below for things like your glasses cases or your phone or whatever you want to roll around down there, groceries, things like that. And then on the top, we have a single Qi wireless charging mat. For some reason, the volume and power control for the infotainment system, a small storage cubby, and then the two big cup holders. If I did have one wish, it would be that they moved the power button to up here to give us a second charge mat or something like that along that area. But I do like the clean look of this center console. The shiny black plastic, though, that could be a bummer because it's probably going to scratch a bit more easily than some of the matte options. If you're worried about a lack of physical buttons, fear not. We do have physical controls here for the dual zone climate control system up front. The third zone is controlled either via the rear controls or via the touchscreen right there. You just press that button, the third climate control zone controls pop up. Now, continuing all the way back, we get a soft touch armrest, and that opens to reveal a pretty large storage area. There's a storage divider, and this is about big enough to put a complete gallon of milk inside. Where are the rear passenger cup holders? Well, thankfully they are not on the doors, as we've seen in some other GM models. They're actually back here at the back of that center console. There is one interesting little strip right here between the air vents and the floating console. This contains a USB-C input and a regular USB input for the infotainment system. Of course, you can CarPlay wirelessly if you'd rather, so you don't need to have cords dangling there if you don't want to. To the left of the steering column is where we find the seat memory buttons for the driver, the electric parking brake, auto brake hold function, etc. And then back up to the dashboard, we have a full color heads-up display. This heads-up display module is not quite as well integrated as some vehicles, but I think given the price tag of the Buick, it's pretty well done. Head-up displays look a little bit small on camera sometimes, but it's about the same size as the head-up display we find in some of the competition. All right, let's get the new Enclave out on the road. Probably the first thing I think we both noticed is the amount of engine noise we get in the cabin.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. It's a smaller engine, right? 4-cylinder turbo, but it's working pretty hard and we can hear most of it.
Yeah, I will say that the engine is about as gruff as the one in the Highlander, the Grand Highlander, and the Lexus TX. All three of those share that same 2.4-liter turbo. It's not as powerful as this, so obviously keep that in mind, guys. Like you may get a little bit more engine noise in here, but you also get 320 some odd horsepower.
Yeah.
I think the difference for me is that somehow I'd expected a little bit more sound deadening in the Buick. I think the cabin noise and wind noise is better controlled than in the Chevy or the GMC, but right now we're going 40 miles an hour. If I accelerate moderately, we're not speeding.
Yeah.
Just a general acceleration curve onto the freeway, you are going to hear just a little bit more of that engine noise in the cabin than I had expected.
Yeah, it's not as big of a differential from the other two, like you just said, but one of the things that I noticed is that it's a little bit less offensive than I feel like it was in the TX, and that might be just because of the fact that you paid quite a bit more for that TX, and you're getting more out of this engine, so it's an interesting balancing act.
And I will say that something like a Volvo XC90 has long been known for the somewhat gruffness of its 2-liter turbo, although Volvo has dialed that way down in recent years. They've added extra sound deadening time after time, and the upcoming 2025 refresh of the XC90 is supposed to be yet quieter with even more sound deadening. So They have really worked on that, but this reminds me a lot, I think, of that first XC90 in the second generation back in 2016 when we first got it, where it was just a little bit gruffer than I had expected. Acceleration times, though, those are relatively solid, keeping in mind the size of this vehicle. We recorded a 0 to 60 time just under 8 seconds in this front-wheel drive model. All-wheel drive is not going to change that time because even with traction control off, we didn't have any wheel slip.
Right. And, you know, for 8 seconds, we're not paying for performance SUV. I mean, for a Buick 3-row to be in the conversation of an XC90 in any regard is probably a benefit. And the fact that it's not going to be on the performance level of something like that, not a big problem.
And it's worth noting, of course, that the only XC90 that's going to be faster than this is going to be the B6 or the plug-in hybrid.
The Recharge.
The regular B5 standard engine is actually going to be right around this same sort of, 7.8 to 8 seconds 0 to 60 time, because it has a significant amount less power out of that standard engine.
And since there is only one option available, the standard engine is a quality engine.
And it is also worth noting, you're not going to get this feature in the competition. Super Cruise is definitely a solid reason to get this. And Super Cruise, if you didn't know it, guys, is now available on rural highways like this. It's not just out on the interstate where the first generation of Super Cruise worked. This will work with trailers. It will change lanes for you now, and it will even function on rural highways like this. We'll just, continue talking about the car. We'll see how long this lasts. But I now can't look at the camera. Now I have to look straight ahead, because that actually is one of the things that I really like about Super Cruise versus some of the other autonomous and semi-autonomous systems we see out there. Most notably, of course, the Tesla full self-driving, is GM's not kidding when they say you must look at the road. Like, if your eyes deviate from right there for too long, it just says, nope, I can't Super Cruise you. Bearing in mind we haven't been driving this on our usual test surfaces, I have to say the cabin's been pretty quiet out on the highway. Again, a little bit more engine noise when accelerating, but just steady state highway cruising, road noise, and wind noise are really well controlled.
Yeah, we've been on pretty decent roads out here, but we've got acoustic glass, we've got active noise cancellation, and all of that is doing a very good job so far.
You will find a bit more acoustic glass in some of the more expensive luxury options, but again, keep in mind the price of this. Now, I have had a lot of commentary back on our reviews of the GMC and the Chevy alternatives. A lot of people were upset that GM decided to go in the direction of this 2.5 liter 4-cylinder turbo. They were saying, why did they do that? Why didn't they just stick with the V6? Well, we get a lot more torque out of this engine than we did out of the V6. We also do get better real-world fuel economy. Not only is there an EPA benefit, there's a real-world benefit. We've come up from Portland, we're going all the way to Tillamook here, so we've climbed up a reasonable amount of elevation. Still been averaging over the EPA estimate for this particular vehicle.
Yeah, anytime you can go over that EPA estimate is a win. And it obviously depends on how you drive it, but you're going to be able to eke out a few more miles per gallon on a small turbo like this if you drive it carefully than versus that V6. So I think I'm okay with the engine solution. I understand that other people might have different preferences. I would love to see other engine options, but really more a hybrid option than a high performance option.
I would have to agree with you.
I think that's the one thing we're missing.
That is the one thing we're missing. We've been averaging about 23.5 miles per gallon over a day of mixed driving here, again, hill climbing included. That's really solid for any regular engine in this segment. The 8-speed automatic transmission is pretty responsive, and I will say, thanks to the turbo, it doesn't spend a lot of time shifting. So that's one of the really good advantages. If you live in a hilly area, you will notice that versus the old Enclave, it had to spend a lot more time shifting and changing gears as you're hill climbing. Here, there's just so much low-end torque that's absolutely not needed. If you want to tow heavier loads, you might be pleased to know that this 2.5 liter engine is based off of the Truck 2.7, so it definitely has that same truck durability cycle associated with it. But the V6, of course, in the old one sounded better.
Yeah, and it's a small sacrifice, ultimately, I think. And for someone who's really worried about how it sounds, this probably wasn't necessarily what they were looking at in the first place. And if it's a sacrifice to get better fuel economy, to get more power, that's what I'm probably willing to make.
Yep, and I will say, though, speaking of the sacrifice, if you're looking at a Grand Highlander, it's going to be significantly less peppy than this, because it's the same hybrid system as in some of the much smaller vehicles in Toyota's lineup. It's essentially a slightly tweaked version of what we find in the RAV4, jammed in that really big Grand Highlander. It's going to be slower than this, but it's going to give you 30 miles per gallon, which I think is a really, really good payoff for just the amount of engine noise you get in that cabin.
Yeah.
30 miles per gallon, solidly achievable, but when you're hill climbing, etc., in the Sienna and in the Grand Highlander, you're really going to hear that engine working an awful lot. It's really going to be spinning fast in order to get you down the road. But again, you're rewarded by over 30 miles per gallon in the real world.
And if we had a hybrid option here, I'd like to see it get close, even if it doesn't get right to it. You know, maybe it's a little bit more powerful. Whatever that system is, I'd love to see it. Hopefully we do in the next couple of years.
Now let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. How much is the Enclave going to set you back? Well, as you'd expect, being the more premium alternative to the Chevy and the GMC, the price tag is a little bit higher than some. $46,395 is where this is going to start for the preferred trim. Although, in typical Buick fashion lately, it comes with an awful lot of standard equipment. If you want the Sport Touring trim, which has the more sporty appearance up front, the blacked out wheel arches in shiny black, that's going to be $48,795. Remember that Sport Touring does not actually get you wider tires. The Avenir has the widest tire available, and it doesn't get you any more power under the hood. Same 2.5-liter turbo, same 8-speed automatic happens under there. If you want the Avenir trim, which is what we're looking at today, this started at $59,395 and completely fully loaded will end around $65,000 or so. Super Cruise is optional on every trim. It's a $3,255 option, and that's certainly something I would get in the Enclave because Super Cruise is an entire reason all to its own to choose this over really a lot of alternatives, including vehicles like even a Volvo XC90 or an Acura MDX or that Lexus TX, because you won't find hands-off-the-wheel steering assistance systems in those vehicles, but you will find it here. The only other option really that offers that kind of functionality is the Jeep Grand Cherokee L. Now, how does that compare to the competition? Well, obviously, it's going to depend on what you want to call the competition. And that's where the Buick is not as easy to categorize as something like the Lexus TX or the Toyota Grand Highlander, because the Grand Highlander's more direct competitor is, of course, the Chevy Traverse, and the Lexus's more direct competitor would be the Cadillac XT6. Logically priced and feature set wise, and I think styling and interior design, etc., this slots right between a lot of worlds. But oddly enough, I really think the interior design really pits this very directly against the Lexus TX. The Lexus TX's interior doesn't come across as overly premium. In the latest generation of a lot of Lexus products, they've decided to delete things that Lexus had long been known for, like real wood trim, more premium finishes, etc. The Lexus is probably going to be more reliable in the long term, but this is also significantly less expensive. A relatively comparably priced Lexus TX with the 2.4-liter turbo that's going to give you less horsepower than this is going to be about $9,000 more expensive. And it's not going to have Super Cruise. Admittedly, adding Super Cruise to the Avenir trim is going to narrow that gap a little bit, but we're still talking about something that's significantly less expensive, likely is going to have a better deal and cheaper financing on the dealer lot. If my money were on the line, I would probably gravitate towards this because of its price tag, because of Super Cruise, and because the back seat is significantly larger. This is something I mentioned earlier in the video, but it's really important for me to continue to drive home. A lot of folks out there will tell you when you look at the spec sheet, the third row is a little bit smaller than some of the other alternatives. Remember, however, it all depends on where the second row and the first row are positioned. It's only a problem if you have a 6'9" person up front and a 6'5" person in the second row where those rows are all the way back, then sure, you're gonna have a little bit less room in the third row, but you would actually have even less room in something like a Lexus TX or a Toyota Grand Highlander because there are more than 3 inches more combined legroom in this cabin than we find in the Toyota or Lexus. It's just a cavernous interior, and that is a reason all to its own to buy a Buick. Now, it doesn't have the dynamics, the driving dynamics to really compete with an Acura MDX or a Volvo XC90 or anything in that more luxury side of the segment, but versus the average Lexus TX, honestly, I would say it's an incredibly solid competitor, and I would probably pick this. The only last hang-up I have is, of course, the view that you're looking at right here. The front-end design, not exactly my preference. I do think the GMC Acadia's front-end design looks more attractive to my eye. It has grown on me a little bit, but not enough for me to love the front-end design. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section, of course. See all of you later, and hopefully we will have one of these at home to do a complete battery of tests and more direct comparisons against the competition pretty soon. In the meantime, however, if you're shopping for a 3-row SUV and you want something a little bit fancier, this should absolutely be on your list. Should it be at the top or not? Let me know.